Right now, somewhere deep in the Indian Ocean, there is an Indian nuclear-powered submarine gliding completely silently through the water.
Right.
But what makes this moment historically significant isn't just the vessel itself. It's the fact that for the first time in decades, according to global intelligence, that submarine is carrying live, operationally deployed nuclear warheads.
Which is a massive shift.
Yeah, I mean, they aren't stored in some vault on land hundreds of miles away from missiles anymore. They are mated, they're loaded, and they are ready to fire.
Exactly.
So today we are looking at exactly why India just quietly escalated its nuclear readiness and what that tells us about the rapidly deteriorating security landscape around us. So welcome to the Daily Deep Dive, the 3D initiative of UPSC with Saurabh Kaushik.
Glad to be here.
If you are a UPSC aspirant gearing up for the toughest exam in the country, or honestly just an insanely curious learner trying to make sense of the world, you are in exactly the right place. So, okay, let's unpack this. Our mission today is to decode the current affairs notes for June 30th, 2026, and extract the exact analytical nuggets you need for GS papers 1, 2, and 3, plus your prelims mapping.
And, the key to really mastering this material isn't just rote memorization of the headlines. It's understanding the underlying mechanics.
Right, the why.
Exactly. We are going to deconstruct the how and the why of India's strategic, political, and economic moves. I mean, we'll look at the mechanisms driving these decisions from constitutional law all the way to sovereign wealth financing.
Yeah, so here is your rapid-fire overview of where we're going today. We'll start at our volatile borders, analyzing the cascading effects of the Pakistan-Afghanistan clashes and how that regional instability connects, well, directly to that nuclear submarine deployment we just talked about.
Right, because everything is connected.
Right. Exactly. But deploying covert military power raises a massive democratic question about accountability, which we'll explore through the lens of recent military operations. From there, we're going to pivot inward to the friction reshaping the Indian polity. We will look at why states are actively fighting the center's massive new rural development architecture.
The whole VBG-RAMG situation.
Yeah, that one. Plus, how West Bengal is attempting to turn the Uniform Civil Code into a state-level weapon, and how the Sangh Parivar ecosystem is recalibrating its legal strategies post-Ayodhya.
And then we tackle the engine of the state, right? The economy and infrastructure. We will dissect the exact structural roadblocks that are just totally stalling the $190 billion India-U.S. trade deal.
Still stalled, yeah.
Unpack the mechanics of a massive 30,000 crore rupee injection into India's sovereign infrastructure fund, and examine how we are securing our physical borders with the Border Roads Organization while simultaneously securing our agricultural heartland with localized generative AI for, 4 crore farmers.
It's massive. And we'll also break down the algorithmic reality of the RBI's new digital fraud compensation rules. Finally, we'll examine how all this policy impacts the literal physical realities of citizens.
Public health and environment.
Right. We will analyze the urgent push for harm reduction in India's drug policy, decode the maternal health targets of the Suman 2030 roadmap, and look at the brutal environmental calculus driving Delhi's 2028 ban on new petrol two-wheelers.
And we end with Europe.
Yeah, ending with the geopolitical paradox of air conditioning as Europe basically melts under record heat waves. It is a massive stack of intelligence. So let's jump right into the geopolitical tightrope at the Durand Line.
Yeah, so the situation on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border has, it's really moved past isolated skirmishes into this sustained cyclical loop of escalation.
Right.
To understand the mechanics of this, we really have to look at the events of late June 2026. On June 28th and 29th, Pakistani security forces launched coordinated ground operations and what they call calibrated airstrikes deep inside Afghan territory.
Wow. Where exactly?
Specifically hitting the Paktia, Paktika, and Kunar provinces.
And Pakistan claimed these strikes were surgical, right? Like targeting 29 militants belonging to Jamaat-ul-Ahrar and the TTP, the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan.
That was the official line.
But the Afghan authorities immediately pushed back, stating that the strikes actually hit residential compounds, resulting in 36 civilian casualties. And there are even those horrifying reports from the Chamkani district in Paktia of double-tap strikes.
Yeah, and for those who might not know, a double-tap strike is a brutal tactical maneuver.
Right.
Basically, a primary strike hits a target, and then a secondary strike is timed a few minutes later, specifically to kill the first responders and civilians who rush in to help the victims.
It's awful.
It is. But we can't analyze these airstrikes in a vacuum. They were a direct retaliation for a massive intelligence failure and security breach just like 24 hours earlier.
You're talking about the Karachi attack.
Exactly. On June 27th, militants brazenly attacked the Pakistan Rangers regional headquarters in Karachi.
And let's pause on that for mapping purposes, because Karachi isn't some remote border outpost in the mountains. It is the capital of Sindh province. It's Pakistan's largest city, and it's their primary economic nerve center right on the Arabian Sea.
Which is why hitting the Rangers' headquarters there and killing 3 soldiers is just a massive humiliation for the Pakistani military establishment.
Yeah, Jamaat-ul-Ahrar claimed responsibility, and crucially, one of the captured attackers was actually identified as an Afghan national originating from the Bajar tribal district right on the border.
Which brings us to the root mechanism of this entire conflict. You really have to clearly separate the Afghan Taliban from the PTP, the Pakistan Taliban.
Because they aren't the same thing, even though people confuse them.
Exactly. Yes, they share a Deobandi ideological lineage, and they have a deeply intertwined history of fighting NATO forces together, but their geopolitical objectives are entirely distinct today.
Right.
The Afghan Taliban are now the sovereign rulers of Afghanistan. The TTP, on the other hand, is an insurgent group actively trying to overthrow the Pakistani state.
Okay, so what is Pakistan's main issue with the Afghan Taliban then?
Pakistan's core grievance is that the Afghan Taliban, instead of, securing the border, are providing strategic depth and safe havens to the TTP in places like Kunar and Paktika.
I mean, I look at the map of this region, and the Durand Line just strikes me as this geopolitical phantom limb. It was drawn in 1893 by Sir Mortimer Durand to create a buffer for British India. But in doing so, he literally drew a line right through the middle of the Pashtun tribal homelands.
Split them right in half.
Yeah, it split families, tribes, and even ancient winter migration routes.
Which makes it a fundamentally flawed colonial boundary.
Yeah.
I mean, no Afghan government, not the monarchy, not the U.S.-backed republic, and certainly not the Taliban, has ever formally recognized the Durand Line as a legitimate international border.
Wow.
And because it is highly porous and runs through some of the most unforgiving mountainous terrain on Earth, it creates the perfect geographical mechanism for an insurgency. Militants can just strike in Pakistan and evaporate back into the Afghan mountains before a response can even be mounted.
But let me push back here for a second. From an Indian strategic perspective, why are we just watching this happen? I mean, if Pakistan is bogged down in a bloody, resource-draining insurgency on its western border, isn't that technically a net positive for us on our eastern border?
You'd think so, on paper.
Right. So why doesn't India just quietly fund or support the anti-Pakistan factions and bleed them out?
Because the mechanics of proxy warfare in that specific region are incredibly volatile, and the blowback risk is extreme.
Okay.
India's approach relies on a concept called strategic patience. If you actively fund the TTP, you legitimize state-sponsored terrorism, which completely undercuts India's primary diplomatic weapon against Pakistan on the global stage.
That makes sense. We'd lose the moral high ground.
Exactly. Furthermore, an entirely destabilized, collapsing Pakistan isn't actually good for India. A nuclear-armed state falling into total anarchy right next door is a nightmare scenario.
So wait, we just do nothing?
We calibrate. We maintain a technical diplomatic mission in Kabul, strictly for humanitarian aid and infrastructure engagement with the Afghan people, which, builds goodwill.
Right.
We refuse to endorse Pakistan's violation of Afghan airspace, but we also don't condone the TTP's terrorism. By doing nothing overtly, we basically allow the natural friction between the Taliban and Islamabad to drain Pakistan's military resources for us.
Ah, I see.
They're forced to pull battalions away from the line of control in Kashmir just to secure the Durand Line.
And meanwhile, we're watching China sweat in the background because the notes mention China desperately tried to mediate this conflict back in April 2026, and they completely failed.
Totally failed. Because the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, is the crown jewel of Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative. The CPEC arteries run right through western Pakistan.
Right through the conflict zone.
Yes. If the TTP makes that region ungovernable, billions of dollars of Chinese investments just evaporate. Plus, Beijing is absolutely terrified of radical militancy spilling over the Wakhan corridor into its own Xinjiang province.
So India is perfectly content to let Beijing realize that buying influence in Islamabad doesn't necessarily buy stability.
Precisely.
But this regional instability is forcing India to look at its own ultimate insurance policy. If Pakistan is volatile and China is expanding aggressively, India has to guarantee its deterrence. Which brings us to that monumental revelation from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or CPY.
Right, the 2026 yearbook.
Yeah. In their 2026 yearbook, they confirmed that out of India's estimated stockpile of 190 nuclear warheads, 12 are now officially classified as operationally deployed.
And we really need to emphasize how big this is. This represents a profound structural shift in India's nuclear doctrine implementation. To understand how massive this is, you have to look at the mechanics of India's historical posture.
Right.
Ever since the Pokhran-2 tests in 1998, India has maintained what strategists call a recessed or demated deterrence posture.
Meaning the bomb and the missile were literally never in the same room.
Exactly. The fissile core, the actual explosive warhead, was kept in highly fortified secret bunkers controlled by the civilian scientific establishment.
People like the Department of Atomic Energy and the DRDO.
Right. The delivery systems, like the Agni missiles or the Mirage 2000 jets, were held at separate military bases. If a war broke out, the components would have to be physically transported, assembled, and mated before they could actually be fired.
But wait, if we are now mating them in peacetime, doesn't that inherently violate our 1999 draft nuclear doctrine? I mean, we explicitly committed to a no-first-use policy. If our weapons are loaded and ready to fire at a moment's notice, doesn't that signal to our adversaries that we are preparing for a preemptive first strike?
That is exactly the argument critics make, but it conflates two totally different strategic concepts. Intent versus readiness.
Okay, unpack that.
The no-first-use doctrine is purely a declaration of intent. It says India will never be the first to introduce nuclear weapons into a conflict, period. However, NFU does not legally or strategically dictate the mechanical readiness of your retaliatory force.
And the mechanism forcing this readiness is the submarine.
Exactly. India's nuclear triad is now fully functional, heavily reliant on the sea-based leg. We operate 3 nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines, or SSBNs, the INS Arihant, the INS Ariat, and as of 2026, the INS Aridaman.
Wow.
A submarine's entire strategic value is its stealth. It disappears into the deep ocean for months on a deterrence patrol.
Right, you obviously can't have a submarine surface in the middle of a nuclear exchange, dock at a port, load a warhead onto a K-15 missile, and then go back underwater to retaliate. That defeats the whole purpose.
Exactly. The warhead has to be physically bolted onto the missile inside the submarine's vertical launch silos before it ever leaves port. The physics and the logistics of a sea-based second strike capability demand operational deployment.
Because if an adversary hits us first...
Right. If they manage to wipe out our land-based Agni missiles and our air bases in a surprise first strike, those submarines are literally the only things guaranteeing massive, unacceptable retaliation. To guarantee that retaliation, the missiles on board must be armed.
And let's put this into perspective so we don't sound like warmongers here. 12 warheads is a highly calibrated number. According to the exact same CPI data, China possesses a stockpile of roughly 600 warheads. And they are expanding faster than anyone else on Earth, by the way. And they have 34 of them operationally deployed.
Right.
Pakistan has about 170 in total. India deploying 12 is the mechanical definition of credible minimum deterrence. It's enough to ensure survival, but small enough to prove we aren't initiating some Cold War-style arms race.
Exactly.
And for our UPSC listeners focusing on mapping, you need to tie this directly to Kalpakkam in Tamil Nadu. It's the nucleus of India's strategic tech, deeply involved in the naval reactor development, that makes these SSBNs possible in the first place.
But this shift toward covert, highly responsive military power introduces a massive constitutional friction point.
Oh, definitely.
If you have nuclear-armed submarines running classified patrols and special forces conducting covert actions, how does a civilian democracy actually oversee the military?
Which is the core of the debate surrounding military secrecy versus democratic accountability. And this came to a head recently regarding Operation Sindoor, the 4-day intense military conflict with Pakistan back in May 2025.
Right.
In the years since that operation, the public sphere has been totally flooded with claims. The military says it was a flawless tactical success, but independent analysts claim there were significant friendly fire incidents and intelligence failures. But the reality is the public has zero mechanism to independently verify any of it.
And this is the fundamental tension. On one side of the scale, real-time operational secrecy is an absolute non-negotiable mechanism of war. You cannot have parliamentary debates about troop coordinates or signal intelligence while bullets are literally flying.
Right, we get soldiers killed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But on the other side of the scale, in a mature democracy, you cannot write a blank check for national security without eventually demanding to see the receipt. There has to be retrospective institutional accountability.
But we don't have that architecture. If you look at the United States, their mechanism is the Congressional Armed Services Committee and the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence.
Right.
The lawmakers on those committees have high-level security clearances. The Pentagon is legally required to brief them, sometimes even during covert operations behind closed doors. And in the UK, they have the Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament, which has statutory rights to access classified MI6 and military intelligence files.
Now, contrast that with India. The Parliamentary Standing Committee on Defense operates entirely in the unclassified realm. If the military chiefs do not want to discuss the tactical failures of an operation, they simply cite national security, and the committee has no legal mechanism to force disclosure.
None at all.
The Comptroller and Auditor General, the CAG, can audit how many rupees were spent buying a drone, but they cannot audit the operational logic of why that drone crashed during a mission.
So what happens when a citizen tries to force the issue using the law? They file an RTI, right, but they hit an absolute brick wall.
Yes, Section 8(1)(a) of the Right to Information Act of 2005. It is an incredibly broad legal mechanism.
How broad?
It exempts any information whose disclosure would prejudicially affect the sovereignty and integrity of India, the security, strategic, scientific, or economic interests of the state. It is the ultimate shield.
Wow.
While it is definitely necessary to protect genuine secrets, legal analysts argue it has become a default excuse to hide administrative incompetence or tactical errors from public scrutiny.
But wait, hasn't India done post-operation audits before? What about the Kargil Review Committee in the year 2000? That was a massive, highly critical document that completely overhauled our intelligence apparatus.
That is the exception that proves the rule, unfortunately. The Kargil Review Committee, led by K. Subramaniam, was a brilliant piece of accountability. But it was an ad hoc committee, convened specifically for that one war, and its unclassified release was a political decision.
It wasn't permanent.
Exactly. It was not a permanent standing institutional mechanism.
So the proposed solution being discussed in policy circles is the creation of a joint parliamentary committee on national security, modeled after that UK system, where members take a legally binding oath of secrecy and are granted statutory access to classified post-operation reports.
Right.
They also want a time-bound declassification policy. Say 25 years after an event, the files are automatically declassified for historians to review, removing the permanent veil of secrecy.
Exactly. Because as India's military capacity scales up, as we operate nuclear triads and conduct cross-border strikes, the institutional mechanisms governing civil-military relations must scale up simultaneously.
Okay, we spent a lot of time on how the Indian state secures its borders against external threats. Let's pivot inward.
Good idea.
We need to look at the internal borders, the friction between the center and the states, and how constitutional power is actually wielded. We're going to look at three very different topics here, and I want to remind our listeners, we are analyzing these purely through the lens of constitutional law, governance mechanisms, and UPSC relevance. No taking sides here.
Right, strictly analytical. The first area of internal friction is the massive pushback from several states against the center's new rural development architecture, the VBG-RAM-G convergence framework.
Right, the Vikasit Bharat Gram Rojgar Mauligram Vikas Act of 2025. If you look at a PowerPoint presentation in New Delhi, this framework looks like an absolute masterpiece of administrative efficiency.
On paper, yes.
Because this is basically saying we have all these separate schemes, MG and RGS for rural employment, PMAYG for housing, PMGSY for roads, the Jal Jeevan Mission for water. Instead of running them in silos, we are creating a single, unified legal framework.
The mechanism here is a singular district or block-level convergence committee. Instead of a village head applying to 4 different departments to build a road, a house, and a well, they use one unified IT platform.
Sounds great.
The stated goal is 100% saturation of eligible beneficiaries. It is the ultimate manifestation of the one nation, one scheme architecture.
Right. So my question is, if it cuts out the bureaucratic middleman and guarantees better delivery, why are states like Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and West Bengal fighting this tooth and nail? Are they just playing opposition politics?
It's much deeper than partisan politics. It goes to the very core of federal autonomy and how money moves in India. The states are raising 3 highly technical objections based on the mechanics of governance.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, the administrative reality. The center mandates a single massive IT portal, but states have their own legacy digital systems and local languages. Retraining hundreds of thousands of Gram Panchayat workers overnight to use a centralized portal is a logistical nightmare that disrupts actual welfare delivery on the ground.
Makes sense. The second objection is the money, I assume.
Always the money. Opposition-ruled states fear this convergence is a Trojan horse for conditionality. Currently, funds for these schemes are transferred based on specific, predictable formulas. If everything is bundled under VBG-RAMG, states fear the center will use compliance with the new IT systems or central branding as a prerequisite for releasing funds.
Oh, wow. So if a state refuses to put the prime minister's photo on a rural housing project, does their entire converged rural development budget get frozen?
That's the fear. That is a massive point of leverage, and it's going to be a massive headache for the upcoming 16th Finance Commission, which has to referee how tax revenue is actually shared. But there's a third objection, and this one is purely legal, specifically regarding MGNREGA.
Yes, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act of 2005. The mechanism of MGNREGA is totally unique in the Indian welfare state because it is a rights-based legislation.
Exactly.
It is not a government handout. It is a legally enforceable guarantee of 100 days of wage employment. If a citizen demands work, the state is legally bound to provide it within 15 days or pay an unemployment allowance.
Right. By blending MGNREGA into a general pot with schemes like rural roads or housing, which are purely discretionary schemes based on available budgets, the states argue you are watering down the legal guarantee.
You are turning a fundamental right to work into just another line item on a block committee spreadsheet.
Precisely. NIIF constantly champions cooperative federalism, but the states are arguing this is actually coercive federalism. The center holds the purse strings, designs the architecture in Delhi, and forces the states to act as mere implementation agencies, stripping away their constitutional flexibility to design welfare around local realities.
So if VBG-RAMG is an example of states desperately trying to keep the center out of their administrative domain, West Bengal's latest move is the exact opposite.
Totally the opposite.
They are actively seizing a legislative weapon traditionally wielded by the center. I'm talking about West Bengal's announcement to table its own Uniform Civil Code bill.
This is a profound inversion of the traditional political dynamic in India. For decades, the Uniform Civil Code has been the core ideological and legislative project of the BJP at the center.
Right.
The ruling party in West Bengal, the Trinamool Congress, has historically opposed it at the national level, arguing it infringes on minority rights. Now, the chief minister is moving to pass a state-level UCC.
But wait, how does a single state pass a uniform civil code? Doesn't uniform imply the whole country? What is the constitutional mechanism here?
We have to look at two parts of the Constitution for this. First, Article 44 in the Directive Principles of State Policy, which states the state shall endeavor to secure for the citizens a uniform civil code throughout the territory of India.
Right, but it's a directive, not a legally enforceable mandate.
Exactly. But crucially, personal laws which govern marriage, divorce, inheritance, and adoption are placed in the concurrent list of the 7th Schedule, specifically List 3, Entry 5.
Ah, so because it's on the concurrent list, both the Parliament in New Delhi and the state legislative assemblies have the constitutional authority to draft laws regarding personal matters.
Exactly. And Uttarakhand already set the legal template in early 2024. They passed India's first modern state-level UCC Act, administered out of Dehradun.
What did that do, practically?
It standardized the age of marriage, bans polygamy, equalized inheritance rights across genders, and controversially mandated the legal registration of live-in relationships, though it explicitly exempted scheduled tribes to protect indigenous customs.
But here is the massive constitutional catch. If personal laws are concurrent, we already have central laws like the Hindu Marriage Act or the Indian Christian Marriage Act. If West Bengal passes a law that contradicts a central law, doesn't the central law automatically win?
Normally, yes, due to the doctrine of repugnancy. However, there is a specific constitutional bypass valve, Article 2542.
Okay, how does that work?
If a state legislature passes a law on a concurrent subject that conflicts with an existing central law, the state law can still prevail if it is reserved for the consideration of the President of India and receives their assent.
So West Bengal can pass the bill in their assembly, but it doesn't actually become law unless the president in Delhi signs off on it.
Correct. Uttarakhand got that presidential assent because their state government was politically aligned with the center. West Bengal is not. So passing this bill is less about immediate implementation and more about political positioning.
Interesting.
They are trying to draft a progressive UCC, likely focusing heavily on women's inheritance rights and strict standardization of marriage ages, while deliberately stripping out the polarizing elements like live-in relationship registries that Uttarakhand included.
It is a brilliant, aggressive legal strategy. By drafting their own version, they seize the narrative. They can say to their voters, we aren't against gender justice or uniform laws, we're just against the center's version of it. They're taking the BJP's oldest ideological plank and turning it into a pan-party governance competition.
It's a huge shift.
And remember, Goa is currently the only state with a functioning UCC, but that's just a historical hangover. They still use the Portuguese Civil Code of 1867.
And we really cannot ignore the Supreme Court's role in this mechanism. The judiciary has been practically begging the legislature to fulfill Article 44 for decades. In landmark judgments like the Shah Bano case in 1985 regarding Muslim women's maintenance and the Sarla Mungal case in 1995 regarding polygamy and conversion, the court highlighted how separate religious laws often result in severe gender inequality.
Speaking of decades-long socio-legal projects coming to fruition, let's examine how the Sangh Parivar ecosystem is recalibrating post-Ayodhya. This is a fascinating look at the mechanics of social mobilization.
It is. For 40 years, the defining, unifying gravitational force for the RSS, the VHP, and the BJP was the Ram Janmabhoomi movement.
Right.
It provided a singular emotional objective that transcended caste and regional barriers, culminating in the 2019 Supreme Court verdict and the consecration of the temple in January 2024.
But from a sociological perspective, when a mass movement achieves its ultimate goal, it faces an existential crisis. The dragon is slain. What do you do the next morning? How do you maintain the ideological momentum and keep the cadre energized?
You have to find a successor cause, or you have to pivot. The analysis shows a debate within the ecosystem right now. Some argue the movement should pivot entirely to soft power embedding indic knowledge systems into education, focusing on economic hegemony.
But that's not what's making the headlines.
No, the more visible shift is the rise of the Kashi Mathura Baki Hai sentiment, shifting focus to the Ganvapi Mosque complex in Varanasi and the Shahi Edgah in Mathura, claiming they were built over destroyed Hindu temples.
But the mechanism to achieve this is entirely different now. If you look at 1992 and the demolition of the Babri Masjid, that was a massive extra-constitutional mob mobilization. It was chaotic and illegal. But look at what is happening with Varanasi and Mathura today. It is entirely institutionalized. They aren't sending mobs, they are sending lawyers.
That is the defining evolution. The movement has transitioned from street agitation to sophisticated legal warfare. But they face a massive structural roadblock: the Places of Worship, Special Provisions Act of 1991.
Explain how that act works, because it is the linchpin of this entire issue.
The 1991 Act is actually a very simple, very powerful piece of legislation. It essentially freezes the religious character of every single place of worship in India, exactly as it existed on August 15th, 1947, the Day of Independence.
So no changes allowed.
Right. If it was a mosque on that day, it legally remains a mosque forever. If it was a church, it remains a church.
And the only exemption written into that law was the Ayodhya dispute, because that litigation was already heavily underway.
Exactly. So under a strict reading of the 1991 Act, any lawsuit trying to convert the Gyanvapi Mosque into a temple should be immediately dismissed by a judge.
But they aren't being dismissed. The lower courts and the high courts are allowing these cases to proceed. How are they bypassing the 1991 freeze?
By utilizing a brilliant, if controversial, legal gray area. The petitioners are not initially filing a title dispute asking for ownership of the land, which would trigger the 1991 Act.
Okay, so what are they asking for?
Instead, they file civil suits merely asking for the right to worship visible deities on the outer walls, or they request the court to order the Archaeological Survey of India, the ASI, to conduct a scientific survey of the premises.
Their argument is that merely taking radar scans of the basement to ascertain historical facts doesn't technically alter the religious character of the building, and therefore doesn't violate the 1991 Act.
Exactly. It's a procedural workaround. Once the ASI conducts a survey and produces a report claiming evidence of a prior temple structure, as we saw in 2023 and 2024, that report then becomes legally admissible evidence, slowly building the foundation for a future challenge to the 1991 Act itself.
It is the complete institutionalization of the movement. But as the notes point out, just because you win the legal and cultural battle doesn't mean you automatically win the electoral math.
Very true.
Look at the mapping note for Faizabad, the actual parliamentary constituency that houses Ayodhya. Despite the temple consecration happening just months prior, the BJP actually lost the Faizabad seat in the 2024 Lok Sabha elections.
It is a stark reminder of the multidimensional nature of the Indian voter. Emotional and religious mobilization can only carry a campaign so far before local mechanics cast equations, inflation, unemployment, candidate selection reassert themselves.
Okay, we have stabilized the internal polity and secured the borders. Now the state has to figure out how to pay for it all. We are moving into the mechanics of economics, trade, and tech infrastructure. And we have to start with the massive structural friction happening at our economic borders. The India-U.S. trade deal is completely stalled.
It is turning into an agonizing saga, honestly. The U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer was just in New Delhi. The press release was full of diplomatic smiles, claiming significant progress, and they set yet another deadline for an interim mini-deal by August 15, 2026.
Setting a deadline on India's Independence Day is great PR, but the underlying numbers show how absurd this delay is. Trade between the U.S. and India is $190 billion a year. We run a $45 billion trade surplus with them. They are our largest single-country export destination. Why is the mechanism of this deal so broken?
Because the two nations are fundamentally gridlocked on three structural issues, and neither side has the political capital to back down. The first sticking point is digital, the equalization levy.
Remind us how that works.
So in 2020, India realized that massive American tech monopolies, Google, Meta, Amazon, were extracting billions of dollars in advertising revenue from Indian citizens, but routing the profits through tax havens like Ireland.
Right.
So India unilaterally implemented a 2% digital services tax, the equalization levy, on the gross revenues of these foreign digital giants.
And Washington went absolutely ballistic. They view it as a discriminatory tariff directly targeting American exceptionalism in tech. They want it abolished immediately as a non-negotiable precondition for any trade deal.
India's defense was that we would gladly remove our 2% tax the moment the OECD finalized Pillar 1, a global tax framework to tax digital companies fairly everywhere. But that OECD process is moving at a glacial pace, so India refuses to drop its levy and the U.S. refuses to move forward.
Sticking point number 2 is even more politically explosive: agriculture.
Oh, yeah. The American farm lobby is immensely powerful in Congress. They are demanding that India drastically slash tariffs and open its domestic market to American corn, soybean, and especially dairy.
And this is where the U.S. just fails to understand the mechanics of the Indian political economy. You cannot touch the dairy sector in India. It is not run by massive corporate agribusinesses like in Wisconsin.
Exactly.
Indian dairy is millions of smallhold cooperative farmers, often women owning 2 or 3 cows. It is a vital socioeconomic safety net. If you flood the Indian market with subsidized, industrialized American milk powder, you destroy rural livelihoods overnight. It is a third rail in Indian politics. We kept dairy totally out of our trade deals with the UK and the EU.
But here is the mechanism of leverage. The U.S. is an $85 billion export market for India. We need them vastly more than they need us. The U.S. Trade Representative knows this, so they're applying maximum pressure, refusing to give India exemptions on agriculture like the Europeans did.
Yeah, and the third sticking point is India's demand. We want guaranteed, expedited pathways for H-1B visas to ensure the mobility of our IT professionals, who are the backbone of our services export economy.
Right.
But immigration is the most toxic subject in the U.S. Congress right now. The USTR literally cannot make binding legal promises on visa caps without Congress throwing a fit.
So you have a Mexican standoff. If they do sign something on August 15, it will likely be a superficial delete agreement cutting tariffs on non-controversial items like pecans or motorcycle parts, while kicking the massive structural issues of digital taxes and dairy down the road.
But here is the strategic reality. If the U.S. is actively stonewalling our export growth, India realizes it cannot rely purely on foreign trade for wealth generation. We have to manufacture our own capital domestically to build our infrastructure. This is exactly why the cabinet just quietly authorized a massive 30,000 crore rupee injection into the NIIF.
The National Investment and Infrastructure Fund. This is one of the most sophisticated financial mechanisms in the Indian state apparatus, established back in 2015.
Now, people often call the NIIF a sovereign wealth fund, but I feel like that is a totally misleading analogy. When I think of a sovereign wealth fund, I think of Norway's oil fund or Saudi Arabia's PIF countries that pump oil, make trillions in surplus cash, and invest it abroad to make a return.
Right, they have excess capital.
But India is a net importer of oil. We run a fiscal deficit. We don't have a giant pool of surplus cash lying around. So how does the NIIF actually function?
You are entirely correct. It is not a traditional sovereign wealth fund. It is structurally a fund of funds. The mechanism relies on leveraging sovereign credibility to de-risk private investment. Here's how it works. The government of India acts as the anchor investor. They commit to putting down 49% of the capital for a specific infrastructure fund.
Like a seed investor in a startup. But why exactly 49%? Why not 51%?
Because at 49%, the fund is technically not a government-owned entity. It escapes the suffocating red tape of PSU regulations and CAG audits, allowing it to hire top-tier private equity talent. But having the sovereign government backing 49% of the project acts as a massive shock absorber for risk. It signals to the global market that the Indian state guarantees the viability of these projects.
It crowds in the heavyweights.
Exactly. The remaining 51% is sourced from massive global pools of patient capital pension funds and sovereign investors who want steady 20-year returns, but are terrified of emerging market risk. We are talking about the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, ADIA, Singapore's Temasek, the Qatar Investment Authority, and the Canadian Pension Fund, CDPQ. The government's 49% absorbs the sovereign risk, making the project highly attractive to global capital.
And just for clarity for our UPSC listeners, do not confuse the NIIF with the NIP, the National Infrastructure Pipeline.
Crucial distinction. The NIP is a spreadsheet. It is a 111 lakh crore rupee wish list of physical projects, roads, ports, power grids that India needs to build. The NIP is what we are building. The NIIF is the financial engine that pays for it.
So where exactly is this new 30,000 crore injection going? It's highly targeted, right? It seems like a direct reaction to the geopolitical shocks we saw earlier in 2026, specifically the Hormuz shipping crisis.
Yes. The capital is earmarked for 3 specialized sub-funds designed to build economic resilience against external shocks. First, post-Hormuz energy security, funding the expansion of our strategic petroleum reserve so our economy doesn't halt if a choke point is blocked.
That's huge.
Second, semiconductor and electronics manufacturing, providing the domestic capital required to backstop the India semiconductor mission. And third, climate and green energy transition to aggressively fund solar and green hydrogen scaling.
So that is the financial architecture. Let's look at how that money translates into physical reality on the ground. This brings us to the literal, physical, and digital last-mile connectivity of the Indian state, handled by 2 very different entities, the BRO and Kisan Sarathi. Let's start with the hard infrastructure. The Border Roads Organization just celebrated the 16th raising day of Project Bermank.
The BRO is a phenomenal mechanism of state capacity. Established in 1960 under the Ministry of Defense, they are tasked with building the arteries of the nation in the most hostile topography imaginable, the freezing altitudes of Ladakh, the dense jungles of Arunachal Pradesh. They operate through these specialized, evocatively named projects. Project Bermank focuses on the high-altitude northeast. You have Project Himmank in Ladakh, Vartak, Swastik.
Why is a raising day making the current affairs notes, though? It's because the strategic doctrine underlying these roads has fundamentally shifted.
Exactly.
For decades, India's border strategy was essentially defensive. We intentionally didn't build great roads near the Chinese border out of fear that if the PLA invaded, they would just use our own highways to roll their tanks down into the plains.
It was a strategy of deterrence by denial. But following the Galwan clashes in 2020, the military realized that lack of infrastructure was hurting us more than the enemy. The doctrine shifted to deterrence by rapid mobilization. The Indian Army is currently reorganizing into integrated battle groups, or IBGs.
And what's their goal?
The entire mechanical premise of an IBG is the ability to mobilize armor, artillery, and infantry and deploy them to the zero line within 48 hours of a threat.
And an IBG is completely useless if your tanks are stuck behind a mountain pass that is buried under 20 feet of snow for 6 months of the year.
Precisely. That is the mechanism the BRO is solving. They aren't just paving dirt paths, they are engineering massive all-weather tunnels. The Adel Tunnel under the Rohtang Pass, the Sela Tunnel in Arunachal giving all-weather access to Tawang, and the ongoing drilling for the Zujila and Shinkula tunnels.
These aren't just civilian convenience projects.
Not at all. They are absolute military necessities to ensure that 48-hour IBG deployment timeline remains credible against Chinese infrastructure buildup.
Okay, so the BRO is securing our physical borders with steel and concrete. But at the exact same time, the state is attempting to secure the agricultural heartland with digital architecture. This is the Kisan Sarathi platform. And the scale of this is mind-bending. The Ministry of Agriculture has registered over 4 crore farmers on this AI-driven platform.
This is a masterclass in integrating legacy analog infrastructure with frontier digital technology. The back-end mechanism of Indian agriculture relies on the ICAR, the Indian Council of Agricultural Research.
Right.
They operate a network of 731 Krishi Vigyan Kendras, or KVKs. These are the district-level agricultural science centers, staffed by human experts and scientists. but there are simply not enough human scientists to answer phone calls from 4 crore farmers.
Enter Kisan Sarathi as a digital translation layer. And the recent upgrades are wild. They have fully integrated generative AI and localized large language models.
The mechanism is deeply practical. Imagine a farmer in rural Maharashtra notices a strange yellowing on the leaves of their soybean crop. Previously, they'd have to guess the disease or travel to a KVK. Now, they open the app on a basic smartphone and take a photograph.
And the AI just figures it out.
The AI processes the image, cross-references it with local soil health data and weather patterns from the ICAR database, instantly diagnoses the specific fungal blight, and recommends the exact dosage of fungicide.
And the barrier of literacy has been completely bypassed, which is the best part. The interface uses voice-based AI capable of understanding and generating speech in over 12 regional dialects. The farmer just speaks into the phone, "What should I spray on this leaf?" And the AI talks back in Marathi or Tamil. It provides real-time market price discovery so they aren't cheated by middlemen, and hyperlocal weather advisories. It is a massive leap in agricultural productivity.
It's the dual nature of modern statecraft. You need the BRO to secure the territorial integrity, and you need AI platforms like Kisan Sarathi to secure food and economic stability.
But there's a dark side to 4 crore farmers suddenly conducting their economic lives on a smartphone. Getting millions of first-time internet users online means creating millions of highly vulnerable targets for digital scammers. Which brings us to the urgent regulatory mechanism of Topic 8, the RBI's new digital fraud compensation rules, going into effect in January 2027.
A very hot topic.
Yeah, I read the initial headlines, and they framed it as a massive consumer victory, implying that if you get scammed online, the bank is now legally forced to reimburse you. Is that actually how the mechanism works?
Absolutely not. That is a dangerous misinterpretation of the zero liability concept. The new rules do not give consumers a free pass for negligence.
Oh, really?
If a scammer calls you pretending to be a bank official, and you voluntarily read out your OTP, or you willingly type your UKI PIN into a fraudulent app, you have compromised the core security protocol. In those cases of gross negligence, the consumer still bears the entire financial loss. The bank will not bail you out for handing over your keys.
So what is the actual structural change in these 2027 rules? How does the liability shift?
The new framework forces systemic accountability on the banks through 3 mechanisms. First, operational speed. Banks are now legally mandated to acknowledge a fraud complaint within 24 hours. Second, resolution speed. They have a strict 45-day deadline to investigate and finalize the claim, preventing the endless bureaucratic limbo victims usually face.
Okay, that's good.
But the third and most revolutionary change is the expansion of bank liability into the realm of authorized fraud.
Explain authorized fraud, because that sounds like an oxymoron. If I authorize the payment, how is it fraud?
Under the old 2017 rules, the bank was only liable for unauthorized fraud, meaning someone hacked into the bank's mainframe or cloned your debit card without your knowledge and stole money without your input.
But today, the vast majority of scams are social engineering.
Exactly. The scammer tricks the victim into willingly authorizing the transfer. Under the old rules, if you authorize the transfer, the bank washed its hands of the problem entirely.
But the RBI is changing that calculus.
Yes. The 2027 rules state that if a consumer is deceived into authorizing a fraudulent transfer, the bank shares the liability if the bank failed to deploy adequate algorithmic safeguards.
Ah, this is where the AI comes in on the banking side.
Precisely. The RBI is giving banks a 6-month window to upgrade their back-end mechanisms. Banks must implement AI-driven mule account detection and transaction velocity checks.
Let's break that down. How does a velocity check actually catch a scammer?
When a scammer targets a victim, they rarely transfer a massive sum in one go. They test the pipes. They will convince the victim to send 10 rupees. If it goes through, they immediately push for 50,000 rupees.
Right.
A velocity check is an algorithm that flags an account receiving a tiny test deposit followed immediately by a massive influx of cash, and then immediately attempting to siphon that cash out to a crypto exchange or a foreign account. It recognizes the behavioral fingerprint of a mule account.
So if I get scammed and transfer 50,000 rupees to a fraudster, and it turns out the fraudster's account was exhibiting all the classic velocity spikes of a mule account, but the bank's AI failed to freeze it,
then the bank is deemed partially liable for failing to protect the financial ecosystem, and they must compensate you. It forces the banks to stop acting as passive pipelines and actively police their own networks. But the core action for the listener remains. Report any fraud instantly. The timeline of your report dictates the extent of your liability protection.
All right, we are entering our final section. We've talked about protecting the citizen's wallet. Now we have to talk about protecting the citizen's physical body. We are looking at public health, environment, and climate adaptation. Let's start with a highly contentious debate regarding drug abuse. The notes cover the release of the NSWORD Vision Document 2026-2029, timed with the International Day Against Drug Abuse.
This was the subject of a very critical editorial in the Hindu. The central thesis is that the Indian state's mechanism for handling drug abuse is catastrophically skewed toward punitive law enforcement, almost entirely neglecting the public health strategy of harm reduction.
When we talk about punitive enforcement, we are talking about the NDPS Act, the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act of 1985. It is a draconian piece of legislation.
It is entirely zero tolerance. Under Section 27 of the NDPS Act, the mere possession of even a minuscule personal use quantity of a banned substance is a criminal offense punishable by imprisonment. The mechanism is entirely focused on deterrence through fear. The police arrest the user, throw them in jail, and theoretically the problem is solved.
But the public health experts argue that criminalizing the end user creates a massive structural barrier to treatment. If a heroin addict knows that walking into a government clinic and admitting they have a problem might result in a police raid and a prison sentence, they will simply hide in the shadows.
Exactly. Which brings us to the concept of harm reduction. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the UNODC, recommends a three-pillar mechanism for drug policy. Supply reduction, which is the police stopping the cartels, demand reduction, which is education and rehab, and harm reduction.
Boy, let me play devil's advocate here. A lot of voters look at harm reduction programs, like the government handing out clean needles to heroin addicts, and think, isn't that just state-sponsored enabling? Aren't we just using taxpayer money to facilitate illegal drug use?
It's an understandable moral reflex, but it completely ignores the epidemiological math. Harm reduction doesn't endorse drug use. It acknowledges the reality that some users cannot or will not stop immediately. The goal is to minimize the catastrophic collateral damage of their addiction, specifically the spread of fatal infectious diseases, until they are ready for treatment.
And the numbers back this up terrifyingly.
Look at the data from the National AIDS Control Organization, NACO. In certain northeastern states heavily impacted by cross-border drug trafficking states like Manipur, Mizoram, and Nagaland, the HIV prevalence rate among injecting drug users is staggering, hovering between 6% and 9%.
Wow.
To put that in perspective, the HIV rate in the general adult population of India is 0.2%. The primary mechanism of transmission in the Northeast isn't sexual contact. It is the sharing of infected needles among addicts.
So, by refusing to hand out a clean 2-rupee syringe, the state is essentially guaranteeing a lifelong, incredibly expensive, and fatal HIV epidemic.
Precisely. NACO runs limited needle and syringe exchange programs and opioid substitution therapy clinics, where addicts are given safer oral methadone to stave off withdrawals. But the coverage is vastly inadequate because it constantly clashes with the NDPS Act's criminalization.
The police versus the doctors?
Right. The editorial points to the mechanism used by Portugal. In 2001, Portugal was facing the worst heroin epidemic in Europe. They made a radical structural choice. They decriminalized the personal use of all drugs.
Just to be clear, they didn't legalize it. You couldn't buy heroin at a pharmacy. They just changed the legal mechanism. If a police officer caught you with a personal amount, you didn't go to criminal court. You went to a civil health commission.
Exactly. It shifted addiction from a moral feeling to a medical condition. The results were undeniable. Over the next decade, HIV infections plummeted, fatal overdoses dropped drastically, and the number of people voluntarily entering rehab surged because the fear of prison was removed. The criticism of the new NCORD Vision document is that it relies almost exclusively on aggressive policing and Nasha Mukhtarat's moral awareness campaigns, actively ignoring the life-saving mechanism of harm reduction. Speaking of state interventions to save lives, let's look at the Sumen Roadmap 2030, released by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. This is a massive structural push regarding maternal and newborn health.
The overarching framework here is the Surakshit Matrishva Ashwasan, or SUMAN, scheme, originally launched in 2019. Its mandate is to guarantee zero-expense, dignified, and quality health care for every pregnant woman in the public health system.
Meaning?
This means completely free deliveries, free C-sections, free transport to the hospital, and free postpartum care. The 2030 roadmap is the upgraded operational blueprint. And they have a very specific metric they are chasing, the maternal mortality ratio, or MMR. The target is to drop India's MMR below 70 deaths per 100,000 live births by the year 2030, which perfectly aligns with the UN Sustainable Development Goal 3.1.
And we have to acknowledge that the mechanism of Indian public health has actually achieved remarkable success on this front over the last decade. If you look at the 2014 to 2016 period, India's MMR was around 130.
Which is high.
Yes. By 2018 to 2020, through the aggressive expansion of institutional deliveries, it dropped to 97. The latest sample data suggests it is hovering around 93.
We are bending the curve, but that national average masks brutal regional realities, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The health mechanism in India is highly decentralized. Southern states like Kerala and Tamil Nadu have already achieved the SDG target, with MMRs well below 50. But states in the Empowered Action Group, cluster like Assam, Madhya Pradesh, and Uttar Pradesh, still have MMRs well over 130, driven by poor health infrastructure, lack of specialists, and socioeconomic factors.
So how does the 2030 roadmap actually plan to bridge that gap? What is the new mechanism?
It relies heavily on structural integration. It mandates the rapid expansion of midwifery-led care units for normal deliveries, freeing up doctors for complicated cases. It focuses on strengthening first referral units to ensure emergency obstetric care is available 24/7 in rural blocks. Crucially, it deeply integrates with the anemia Muktarat protocols.
How so?
Severe anemia is a primary mechanism driving maternal mortality in India. By aggressively screening and treating iron deficiency early in the pregnancy, they prevent catastrophic hemorrhaging during delivery.
It's about preventative mechanisms. Now, maternal health, child development, and overall public health are inextricably linked to the environment citizens live in, which brings us to a massive, aggressive policy hammer being dropped in the capital. Topic 11 details Delhi's mandate that starting in 2028, only electric two-wheelers will be permitted for new registration.
This is a monumental shift in the mechanics of environmental policy. For the past decade, India's approach to EV adoption has been entirely incentive-based.
We use the carrot.
Right. Policies like FAME2, the Delhi EV policy, and the recently announced PM eDrive scheme offered massive financial subsidies to reduce the upfront cost of an electric scooter to make it competitive with a petrol one. But Delhi is abandoning the carrot and picking up a massive regulatory stick. Banning the sale of an entire category of internal combustion engines is a structural mandate.
But why target two-wheelers? Why not ban massive diesel SUVs first? They look like the bigger polluters.
It comes down to two mechanisms: sheer volume and engine chemistry. First, the numbers. There are roughly 80 lakh registered vehicles on Delhi's roads, and a staggering 65% of them are two-wheelers. Second, the chemistry. While a modern diesel car has sophisticated catalytic converters and particulate filters, millions of two-wheelers running around Delhi use cheaper, less efficient four-stroke engines, and some older ones still use two-stroke engines.
A two-stroke engine is an environmental nightmare because of how it operates. It burns oil mixed directly with the petrol to lubricate the piston. Because the combustion is incomplete, it spews massive amounts of unburnt hydrocarbons and nitrogen oxides NOx straight out the tailpipe.
Which is toxic.
Yeah, those chemicals react in the atmosphere to form PM 2.5, the microscopic particulate matter that bypasses the lungs and enters the bloodstream.
Exactly. A single, poorly maintained petrol scooter can emit more raw pollution than a modern sedan. By capping their registration in 2028, Delhi is putting a hard ceiling on that baseline pollution.
Just to clarify the mechanics of the law, so there is no panic out there. They're not confiscating your existing petrol scooter in 2028. Existing vehicles can run until they hit the 10 or 15-year age limit mandated by the National Green Tribunal. You just won't be able to buy a new one. But still, let's talk about the socioeconomic reality. The two-wheeler isn't a luxury item. It is the economic backbone of the city.
It really is.
It's the delivery driver, the gig worker, the lower middle-class commuter. Even with subsidies, EVs have range anxiety. If a gig worker lives in a dense, unauthorized colony in East Delhi, they don't have a private garage with a wall socket to plug their scooter in overnight. How do you mandate EVs without crippling the working class?
You have to solve the charging mechanism, which is exactly why NIIF has been heavily pushing the battery swapping framework. You completely separate the battery from the vehicle. When the delivery driver runs out of charge, they don't wait 3 hours at a plug.
What do?
They pull up to a kiosk at a petrol pump, yank out the depleted battery, slot in a fully charged one in 60 seconds, pay a small fee like buying a liter of petrol, and keep working. The mandate only survives if that swapping infrastructure is ubiquitous by 2028.
And this mandate represents a shift toward preventative environmental action. Historically, Delhi relies on reactive mechanisms, specifically GRAP, the Graded Response Action Plan.
Yes. GREP is essentially an emergency brake. When the air quality index hits 400 in November, the Commission for Air Quality Management activates GREP Stage 4, which means banning diesel trucks from entering the city, halting all construction, and shutting schools. It paralyzes the economy. The 2028 EV mandate is an attempt to permanently lower the baseline pollution so we don't hit those emergency thresholds as often.
So Delhi is trying to permanently mitigate the vehicular heat and toxic air generated by its own economy. But our final topic looks at a region battling the brutal heat of the sun itself, and it has sparked a massive political and environmental paradox. Topic 12, Europe's record heat wave and the ferocious politics of air conditioning.
The meteorological reality in late June 2026 is terrifying. Parts of Spain, Italy, and southern France have been consistently hitting 45 degrees Celsius.
That is over 113 degrees Fahrenheit.
And the critical vulnerability mechanism here is infrastructure. Historically, Europe is a temperate climate. Their buildings were designed to retain heat for the winter. Consequently, only about 20% of European households have air conditioning installed.
And suddenly, the climate is altering violently. The heat wave in 2022 caused an estimated 60,000 excess deaths across Europe, largely among the elderly in unair-conditioned apartments. 2026 is tracking to be just as lethal, so you have a massive surge in demand for AC units. But that demand has triggered a massive political clash over the mechanics of climate change.
It is the ultimate tragic paradox of the Anthropocene. The primary mechanism you use to survive climate change, the air conditioner, is also one of the most potent mechanisms accelerating climate change. The European political establishment is totally fractured.
How so?
The pro-AC camp, largely in southern Europe, argues that AC is no longer a luxury. It is a basic public health necessity for survival. Governments in Spain and Italy are even offering subsidies for vulnerable populations to install them.
But the anti-AC camp, which is heavily aligned with the EU's Fit for 55 carbon reduction commitments, is terrified. They are looking at the energy grid. Since the geopolitical cutoff of cheap Russian gas, Europe's electricity grid is fragile.
Very fragile.
If 100 million households suddenly install AC units and turn them on simultaneously in July, the surge in electricity demand will crash the grid, forcing them to burn massive amounts of coal just to keep the lights on.
And the grid demand is only half the problem. The other half is chemical. Air conditioners don't just use electricity. They rely on chemical refrigerants to absorb and transfer heat. Historically, the industry uses hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs.
Let's explain the mechanism of HFCs, because this is a crucial UPSC science concept. Why are they so dangerous?
HFCs are synthetic gases. Inside the closed copper coils of your AC unit, they are perfectly safe and incredibly efficient at making the air cold. But the reality of manufacturing, maintenance, and disposal means these gases inevitably leak into the atmosphere. And when HFC molecules hit the atmosphere, they act as super pollutants.
Worse than carbon dioxide.
Oh, absolutely. Depending on the specific type, an HFC molecule can trap thousands of times more heat in the atmosphere than a single molecule of carbon dioxide.
So, by turning on the AC to cool your living room, you are leaking chemicals that exponentially heat the planet. How does this European crisis connect to India's policy framework?
The connection is vital because India's trajectory is the extreme version of Europe's. India's AC penetration is currently low, around 8 to 10%, but it is booming exponentially as the middle class expands. We are aiming for 25% to 40% penetration in the next decade. If hundreds of millions of Indians buy inefficient, HFC-leaking ACs, the global carbon budget is destroyed.
But India actually saw this paradox coming. Back in 2019, India published the India Cooling Action Plan, or ISAP. We were one of the first developing nations to proactively map out a holistic strategy for cooling.
Right.
The mechanism of ISAP isn't just about building better ACs, it's about passive cooling. Designing buildings with better ventilation, using traditional shading, and mandating the purchase of highly energy-efficient 5-star rated ACs to suppress the aggregate demand on our coal-heavy power grid.
And regarding the chemical mechanism, the HFC's India's transition is governed by international law, specifically the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, which India has ratified. The Kigali Amendment mandates the global phase-down of these super-polluting HFCs in favor of natural, climate-friendly refrigerants.
But the timeline is the key diplomatic victory here, isn't it?
Yes, under the fundamental UN principle of common social end. But differentiated responsibilities, or CBDR, India successfully negotiated a much longer runway. While developed nations like the U.S. and the EU have to aggressively phase down HFCs immediately, India's mandatory phase-down schedule only begins in 2032, reaching an 85% reduction by 2047.
That's a huge buffer.
The mechanism acknowledges historical emissions. The West caused the bulk of the crisis, so they must transition first, giving developing nations like India time to adopt cheaper, safer tech without depriving their citizens of life-saving cooling today.
When I look at Europe scrambling to deal with urban heat, I can't help but think of Ahmedabad. Back in 2013, after a brutal heat wave killed hundreds, the municipal corporation created South Asia's first comprehensive heat action plan. The mechanism was beautifully simple and preventative. Early warning SMS alerts, keeping public parks and temples open as cooling centers, and painting thousands of tin roofs with reflective white paint to drop indoor temperatures passively.
That's right.
Over 100 Indian cities have adopted this model now. It is almost like an exportable policy architecture for these European cities that are suddenly facing urban heat islands they were never designed to withstand.
It is a fascinating, poignant reversal of the traditional global dynamic. The global north is now having to look to the global south for survival mechanisms.
All right, we have covered an immense amount of ground today, and we've drilled down into the actual mechanisms driving the headlines. Let's synthesize this deep dive. We started by mapping the volatility at the Durand Line, understanding how the TTP insurgency forces India into a posture of strategic patience, which in turn contextualized the historic mechanical shift of deploying 12 live nuclear warheads on our SSBN fleet to guarantee second strike survivability.
Right.
We examined the severe democratic friction caused by military secrecy in operations like Sindoor, and mirrored that internal friction by analyzing the state's fight for administrative autonomy against the VBG-Ramji convergence, alongside West Bengal's aggressive constitutional maneuvering with the UCC bill. We tracked the institutionalization of the Sangh Parivar strategies through the legal loopholes of the Places of Worship Act.
We then pivoted to the structural gridlock stalling the $190 billion U.S. trade relationship, dissecting the mechanisms of digital taxes and dairy lobbying. We saw how India is responding by fortifying its own capital through a 30,000 crore risk-absorbing NIIF investment and expanding its physical and digital reach through the BRO's high-altitude tunneling and Kisan Sarathi's localized generative AI. We unpacked the algorithmic liability shift in the RBI's fraud rules and detailed the epidemiological necessity of harm reduction in our drug policy. And we brought it all home with the preventative health mechanisms of the Suman 2030 maternal targets, the brutal vehicular chemistry driving Delhi's 2028 EV mandate, and the tragic geopolitical paradox of air conditioning as the world adapts to extreme heat. It is a phenomenal amount of information, but it's all connected by the central thread of the Indian state frantically upgrading its legal, physical, and digital mechanisms to survive in a volatile century. And that rapid institutional upgrade brings us to our final thought. Today we discussed incredible leaps in capacity. We're using localized AI to diagnose crop diseases for 4 crore farmers. We have engineered nuclear submarines capable of launching operationally deployed warheads from the depths of the ocean. We're pooling 30,000 crore rupees to build out the semiconductor pipelines of the future.
There's a lot of progress.
But as the Indian state aggressively accelerates its hard military and technological power, our discussion on Operation Sindoor revealed a glaring institutional void. The provocative question I want to leave you with is this. While our technology and our military reach are firmly entering the 21st century, is our constitutional architecture for democratic accountability. Our parliamentary oversight, our declassification laws, our right to information, still stuck in the 20th century.
Wow.
If the state's power expands, but the citizens' mechanism to audit that power does not, what happens to the balance of the republic? Food for thought.
A brilliant, necessary question to leave them with. Thank you for joining us on this exhaustive UPSC deep dive. Remember to stay curious, keep looking past the headlines to find the mechanisms underneath, and always question the why behind the news. Have a great day.